Okay, hello viewers. Thanks for joining us. I think we're due to start in about 20 minutes or so, so thanks very much everyone for joining us, and enjoy the show.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Perth Town Hall for this very special occasion. Let me begin by acknowledging that we are on Noongar Whadjuk country. We are honoured to have with us Mr. Naoto Kan, Prime Minister of Japan from June 2010 to August 2011. To you, sir, can I say, welcome to Western Australia. Nishi Goshu I Yokoso. My name is Chris Tallentire and I'm the Shadow Environment Minister in the West Australian Parliament, and I'm honoured to be your MC for this evening. I'd like to now invite Mingali Wanjuru, a strong advocate for her people and for her land. Also, please welcome Alfie, who will tell us, will read us a poem and welcome us to country and share a part of it with us. Welcome them to the stage, please.
Wow, I wish I was doing this when I was teaching. Welcome to country. When we do welcome to countries here, we always remember that our spirits are with us, our ancestors. They're still around us and guiding us. So when we speak and say welcome to people, we do it on their behalf and as well as the present people. This time is a great time because whitefellas and other people from other countries as well, welcome to distinguished guests. I had a Japanese expression and I've forgotten it, it's gone. So you have to welcome to you. And everyone else, it's great to see so many people. And it's about time that we all got together like this. It's probably one of the best times in history, and I've said this probably for 5 years, where environmentalists are coming together with the original Aboriginal way of looking after country. I bring in gum trees. What I do when I've been walking around, I'm not walking very well now, is I usually give someone a leaf and get you to think about what does it mean to us, and to you as well now, of course. And it means many things, like this is our shelter, medicine, and all sorts of things. But I might let you think about that, what the tree means. It's very precious. And in that, I'd like to say welcome to country in Noongar. And always say in the tradition of our ancestors. And we welcome you. So, Kaya, Ngana European project, Noongar Kuja, Waggle Jeretnija, Double Yerrigan, Ura, Double Yerrigan, Rainbow Serpent, Waggle, we have spirit, a great spirit, makes all the waterways. As a long time ago, we say, Kura, long time ago before any other people came to this land. We've got thousands and thousands of years, 40, 60,000 years of looking after the country, and our people kept it in pristine condition. Now with all the mining, the money, looking now especially at uranium, when we can't look after it, we can't put it away safely. It's so unsafe for people, as we already know. So this is the battle now that's going to go on. Try and find some other alternative methods instead of using uranium, because we can't get rid of it. And to some Aboriginal people, and welcome to people from Leonora, who are very distinguished people in their work too, and also a fellow woman there with her friend, and anyone else who's from other areas who know the dangers of what uranium can do. So now the leaf comes from the country, the double Durian and the rainbow serpent, the wobble, creator of the land, creator and carer of all the birds and animals. This country belongs not only to us as people, it belongs to all the birds and animals, and that we have an integral working relationship, and we like to keep that going. But as you probably know here, how the rivers are getting polluted, and it's not pristine anymore. So there's another big thing that's a worry, that our waterways are being poisoned as well, so we don't need any more. But thank you very much for coming and visiting us from another country. Thank you. And to our other people who are here visiting. And welcome to Whadjuk Noongar country. Thank you.
Thank you, Niggly. Yeah, I've got a poem. I just call it The Land. Like when we were young children and we're looking at the land, to me, the land was, it was like a church. And I guess looking at the land, it still is. But this poem I call The Land, I was sitting in the back seat of my brother's car, and this is how everything came about. The land. Sitting in the back seat of my brother's car, reading The Australian, and glanced briefly at my mother's country, the red pulsating land before me. I felt my pulse beat in time to energy, the trees, rocks and soil that emerged from my mother's beautiful land. I'm sure I saw the apparition of my ancestors emerge from the belly of my mother's beautiful land. They waved, sang and danced for me in their ceremonial colours, awesome, and my eyes only. Not the cancerous salinity that dies under the hot sun after the first, second, third settlers had ripped out all the trees in the farming areas of the land we had just passed. Then scribbling on the newspaper, realising I was back to now, I put these words down and began to think realistically. We, the Noongar people of this country they call Australia, have been traumatised and suppressed throughout those assimilation years. Although our land has been taken, we must retain and guard our boundaries, as we, the Noongar people, know that we don't own the land passed down to us by the forefathers, that the land owns us. We must cherish the land, the trees, rocks, water, the birds and lizards that live in our sacred soil. Care for it as we would our children, our mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, also the elderly who cared for the land long before the birth of Jesus Christ, so that we can tread in their footsteps and allow our children to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Niggly, and thank you, Alfie. I would like to acknowledge some current and past elected representatives who are here tonight. Former Senator Joe Ballantyne, Senator Scott Ludlam, Member for Fremantle, Simone McGurk, Mayor of Fremantle, Mayor Brad Pettit, the Honourable Robin Chappell, and the Honourable Amber Jade Sanderson. I'd like to now invite Ashwin Cresswell to the stage. During the tsunami and earthquake following nuclear disaster at Fukushima, Ashwin touched so many people with a simple letter that he wrote to former Prime Minister Naoto Kan. He sent that letter through our former Prime Minister Julia Gillard. And the letter reached the Prime Minister Naoto Kan in Tokyo, where the kindness and generosity of spirit from Ashwin also touched the hearts of people there. Ashwin met Mr. Kan today for the first time, and he is here tonight to share his letter with you all and to present a gift to the former Prime Minister. Please make Ashwin feel welcome.
evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ashwin Cresswell, and I'm 11 years old. On March 11, 2011, there was a terrible earthquake and tsunami on the east coast of Japan that killed many people. I wrote a letter to the then Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Naoto Kan, asking for his help to find a young boy called Toshihiro Asawa, who had lost his parents in the tsunami. I am now going to read that letter, which I wrote when I was 8 years old. To the Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Naoto Kan, and the Australian Prime Minister, Miss Julia Gillard. Dear Miss Julia Gillard, my mother said Prime Ministers can talk to other Prime Ministers. Can you please send this letter to the Japanese Prime Minister? Dear Mr. Naoto Kan, my name is Ashwin Cresswell and I live in Parkwood, Western Australia. I am 8 years old and I go to Parkwood Primary School. I do not speak Japanese, but I hope you speak Australian. I saw a picture of a boy named Toshihiro Asawa in our newspaper. My mother read me his story and she told me that he lost his parents in the tsunami. Do you know this boy? Does he have any favorite thing to eat and drink? Does he have a favorite shirt? If he doesn't, he can borrow one of mine. If he can't find his parents, he can stay with my family. He can also play with my toys and go to school with me. Would Toshihiro like to stay with us? From Ashwin Cresswell. That is the end of my letter. Thank you, Mr. Khan, for contacting me and asking to meet with me today. I was very touched that you still remembered me after all this time. I have put together a book about my journeys in Japan and the Japanese people who I have met since I wrote to you. I would like to now present this book to say arigato, which means thank you in Japanese, for finding Toshihiro and passing my letter to him.
Thank you very much. Wow, sweet. Thank you very much.
Well done, Ashwin, and thank you, former Prime Minister. Della Rae Morrison was one of the founding members of the West Australian Nuclear Free Alliance, an Aboriginal alliance of people concerned about uranium mining in WA. WANFA formed after the current government lifted the long-held and popular ban on uranium mining. Just weeks before the tsunami, earthquake, and Fukushima disaster, Della had been touring Japan, talking at universities, and touring with the Peace Boat, talking about the impacts of Australian uranium on Aboriginal communities. She is here tonight to tell us more about that time and the connections between Australian uranium and Japan. Welcome, Della.
So I had a little tear in my eye. Thank you, Ashwin, that was fantastic. A real inspiration, and we're going to be needing young people like you for the future. So konnichiwa, wanju, kaya.
Wanju, Nija, Wajak. Thank you, and thank you for being here today on Aboriginal country. Young woman, Wilmanyok. Narragin. I'm a Bibbulmun woman from the southwest of Western Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge my ancestry as a Bibbulmun woman. In 2009, the government lifted the ban on uranium after people like Joe Valentine and all the other people who I call caretakers of country, not activists, but caretakers of country, fought very hard to bring that ban about. In 2007, the ban was lifted by the government, and I never really had much concern about any of this business until my ancestors started to come to me in my dreams every night, sleepless nights, about this uranium. And that's when I started to stand up and take a bit more action, and thought this is really dangerous, and this is really important to be a part of this movement. So now we have, I'm not really sure, about 10 or so uranium mines or explorations around Western Australia, and it's contaminating the groundwater right now as the explorations are going on. But what I'm actually here to talk about is my trip to Japan. I flew to Tokyo in January 2011, and I was there with 4 other Australians, and 3 of them were from around Northern Territory, from around the Rangers mine. And I went with Felicity Hill, and we met up with 4 other groups in Tokyo, where we travelled. We spoke at the Tokyo University about our concerns of uranium coming from WA and going to Japan. And we said to a lot of people at these symposiums, our uranium is fueling your nuclear power plants. And you'd be amazed at how many people didn't know that. So while we were there, we met up with Hibakusha, which are the survivors of the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they shared their stories with us. Some of the stories were absolutely, very personal and horrific. But we got to know about them and their stories. We met up with 5 people from Tahiti, Indigenous people from Tahiti, and they were part of the atomic testing out at the Moroa atolls, the Tahitian islands. So we learned more about what goes on there, what went on there, what goes on there. One of the guys, he was a serviceman, a part of that, and how, so he told us all about his health problems and things like that. And there were the 5 students from the peace ambassadors, they call themselves. They're young Japanese students. And they were just taking notes, and they go away and they speak all around the world about what they've learnt. So it's one of the things they learnt about uranium. And so we spoke at the Tokyo University, we spoke in Nagasaki. I went to Nagasaki by myself, and everyone else went on to Hiroshima, and I did presentations around Nagasaki, basically with the same message, saying, we don't want to send our uranium to you anymore, we want you to stop buying it, we want to stop mining it, and we're saying things like, what if you have an earthquake? you know, you're right on the line. And then the earthquake, you know, causes a tsunami. And then, you know, the tsunami affects your power plants. You know, what if that happens? And a lot of people go, no, that's not going to happen. And I think we said this over and over and over again. We spoke to about 5,000 people in about 4 weeks. And still there was that, you know, that constant debating. No, it's never going to happen, it's never going to happen. Yeah, so we spoke around Japan for about a week, and then we went and we met at Yokohama and got onto the peace boat. And we spent 2 weeks on the peace boat doing workshops with each other and then doing presentations in the evening where we pretty much passed on the same message. And then we arrived at Tahiti, and before we got off the boat, we put together a statement between all of us, and which we presented in the Tahitian embassy. And we also toured schools and gave presentations there. So it was 4 weeks of a lot of hard work and you know, and a lot of trying to pass this important information onto each other and onto other people on the peace boat in Tahiti. And even after the trip on the boat, a lot of even Habakisha still believed that nuclear power was the way to go. Just couldn't get the concept that renewable energy could be an option. And that was with a lot of the people in Japan and a lot of the people on the peace boat. I think, and my conclusion was that I came to was that it's been conditioned that way. You know, that this is just in my opinion. I don't want to be offensive to anybody, but it's in my opinion that the conclusion that I came to was their conditioning was that they believed that nuclear power was the only way to go. And so we always had lots of discussions about, well, there's renewable energy, there's other options. And then I heard that after the unfortunate earthquake, tsunami, a lot of the Habakisha have changed their minds, and they now are all for shutting down the nuclear power plants and looking at renewable energy. But unfortunately, it took a disaster like that to change even the Habakisha mind. So, you know, I just want to say no more Habakisha, no more global Habakisha, no more Hiroshima, no more Nagasaki, no more war, no more uranium, and that's it.
Thank you, Della. Thank you for your speech tonight and also for your important work representing Australia overseas. Now to our next speaker, Kado Muir. Kado is the chairperson of the West Australian Nuclear Free Alliance. His family has fought to protect their country from uranium mining for over 40 years. He is here tonight from Leonora to share their story of resistance and strength. Welcome, Kado.
Thank you for the introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have a Gumley. And the Gumley, in being a Wangata man from the deserts of Western Australia, I acknowledge the welcome proffered by Mingli and Alfie, and reflect on the last 20 years that I've known Mingili, having been a cultural custodian for the land, and my family having to fight a nickel miner to stop them from destroying over 200 Aboriginal sites in my land, and we were successful. And that success is rooted in our culture, our connections. The Dreamtime stories of that place are linked to this place. Through the Waggle, back in our country, the Waggle is a kunia, carpet snake. That's the sign. And that snake left our country at a place called Lake Miranda and travelled down into the southwest to then become the Waggle in the southwest. I was fortunate today to have lunch with Naoto Kan, sorry, and at the great cultural institution that we all know as Miss Maud's. And I reflected on that and realised, yes, Miss Maud's is an important part of the Perth landscape. And these connections of life. Australia is an island. Japan is an island. Only in name, we're surrounded by water, but we are connected by life. We are connected by the energies that flow throughout our planet and throughout the universe. And it is these energies which connect us, which sustain life. These energies are the things that are under threat or danger from the poison that lives in the ground. My elders, 40 years ago, stood up to fight against the Yiliri uranium mine. Every year, we walk 300 kilometres from Yiliri down to Leonora. We started that walk on the year that the current government in Western Australia came to power and opened the doors to uranium mining in Western Australia. And as you know, there are 4-year terms here in Western Australia, and we're getting pretty close to the end of that 4-year term. And we may have a change of government, a change of heart. So the thing to remember there, and to take inspiration from, is that we have stopped this mine for the last 3.5 years. This year, and this is putting on my hat of co-chair of the Australian Nuclear Free Alliance, and as the current chair of the West Australian Nuclear Free Alliance, this year we stopped the proposed nuclear waste dump at Muckaty. And as a movement in Australia, we have contained the uranium industry. There is not one mine operating in Western Australia today. Clap for that. And that's our role, that's our path on the ground as the cultural custodians of the land and the caretakers for the future. We're all inspired by Ashwin and his letter. And I know every person in this room, you all feel the spirit of what Ashwin was communicating. We are living beings, we share this planet, we care for each other, we care for the planet, and sadly some of us are misguided. Some of us want to make money, want to generate profit, they want to develop projects that result in harm, because largely they are not held accountable for what they do. And we see that, especially in the industries that, the rapacious industries that go out there and exploit the environment. And the only way that they are ever held to account is by people, is by letters from the likes of young Ashwin, by our friends from Japan, the former Prime Minister, and more importantly, by every single face and person in this room who have come out here to show their support and to say, 1D uranium, leave it in the ground. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I think should be where I'll leave it. But I will say, once again, thank you. And remember that we are not an island, we are connected. And that's what this fight is about, is the fight for life, to sustain that energy and to remind our people that we are part of that spiritual framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Kado, and thank you for the optimism and for highlighting those achievements this movement has already managed to pull off. Over the last 5 years here in WA, we have struggled with uranium exploration, with proposed transport of uranium, and uranium mine applications. West Australians have long been opposed to any involvement in the nuclear industry. This conversation is critical at this time. State government is charging ahead with plans to mine uranium, giving grants to uranium companies through the Royalties for Regions program. The federal government is negotiating uranium sales to India, a country that has continually rejected the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and indicated that Australian uranium would in fact free up domestic uranium supplies for nuclear weapons. In 2012, the Indian Auditor General released a report warning that unless safety issues at Indian nuclear reactors were dealt with, there could in fact be in India a Chernobyl or a Fukushima type disaster. We know Australian uranium was sold to TEPCO and used at the Fukushima reactors. It is important as WA teeters on the edge of becoming a uranium exporting state that we consider our role in supplying the fuel for radioactive weapons, nuclear fallout, and nuclear waste. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the former Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Naoto Kan.
Thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this opportunity here in Perth today.
また2011年の大震災、そして福島原発事故の時には、アシュウィン君の手紙をはじめ、オーストラリアの多くの皆さんから励ましをいただいたことを、改めて当時の総理としてお礼を申し上げます。
And I would also like to once again express my thanks as the Prime Minister of Japan at the time of the earthquake, tsunami and subsequent disaster in Fukushima, to say thank you to all of the people from Australia who sent us so much support and encouragement, including of course Ashwin and his letter.
2011年3月11日午後2時46分、私は国会におりましたけれども、その部屋の大きなシャンデリアが大きく揺れ始めました。
On March 11, 2011, at 2:46 p.m., I was in the hall at the Diet Building, the National Parliament of Japan, and all of a sudden the huge chandelier on the roof of the room began to shake.
最初に原発についてきた報告は、無事に原発を止めることができたという報告でした。その時はホッとしました。
The first report which we received from the nuclear power plant was that it had been able to be safely stopped. And so hearing this report, at first I was so relieved.
それから1時間足らずの時に来た次の報告は、すべての電源がストップした。さらに、すべての冷却機能がストップした。この報告を聞いた時に、今でも思い出しますと、背水が寒くなる、そういう気持ちが湧き上がっています。
However, just 1 hour after receiving this first report, we received the next report, which told us that all of the power had been stopped, and also all of the cooling functions at the nuclear power plant had also been ceased to function there. I still remember thinking back to this now, hearing this, how cold, how it made me feel at the time.
原発はたとえ反応が止まっても、相当長期間、膨大な熱を出しますから、冷やし続けなければ、燃料がそれ自身の熱で溶けてしまって、それが外に出ていく、メルトダウンし、メルトスルーする、そういう危険性を持っています。
And at a nuclear power plant, even if the nuclear reaction is able to be stopped, it continues to have an immense heat for a very long time. And this means that if the cooling does not take place following this, then the fuel can continue to melt and even to go outside of the reactor, to melt down and melt through.
実際に地震が発生してから100時間の間に1号、2号、3号の原発がメルトダウンし、さらにメルトスルーしました。
And in reality, within 100 hours of the disaster occurring, the reactors 1, 2, and 3 at the Fukushima Dai-ichi plant suffered meltdown or melt through.
そして同じ100時間の間に1号、3号、4号の3つの原発がメルトダウンで発生した水素による爆発を起こしました。
And also within this 100 hours, the reactors 1, 3, and 4 on the site there also, as a result of this meltdown, experienced hydrogen explosions.
もしこの事故がさらに拡大していけば、福島第一にある6つの原発と10キロ先の第2にある4つの原発、さらに合わせて使用済み燃料プールが11あります。これらがすべてコントロールできなくなる、まさに瀬戸際のところにありました。
And if the disaster had continued to worsen and expand more than this, we would have faced the situation, of course, of there are 6 reactors at the Fukushima Dai-ichi plant and 4 reactors at the Fukushima Dai-ni plant just 10 kilometers away, and also a total of 11 spent fuel pools combined within these 2 locations as well. If this had continued to become worse, then we would have lost the capacity to be able to control what was happening, and we were just right on the very verge of such a serious situation occurring.
チェルノブイリの事故は福島以前では一番激しい事故でした。しかし、事故を起こしたのは一つの原発です。もし福島の原発事故がそのまま拡大していれば、チェルノブイリの何十倍、場合によっては100倍以上の放射性物質を外にまき散らすことになったでしょう。
The Fukushima nuclear disaster was the worst nuclear disaster the world has experienced since Chernobyl. However, at Chernobyl, the disaster occurred at one single nuclear reactor. If the situation at Fukushima had continued to become worse, we could have faced a situation of many tens or even 100 times more radioactive materials being released than what occurred at Chernobyl.
私はそうなった時に日本がどうなるか考えました。そして東京を含む多くの地域から人々が逃げ出さなければならなくなる。その可能性を考えたときに本当に怖くなりました。
At that time, I had to consider, well, what would happen to Japan if we faced this further situation? And this would mean having to evacuate an area which would also include the capital city of Tokyo. When I had to consider this potential, this risk, this danger that was almost going to happen, it was just terrifying.
実際に原子力委員会の委員長という専門家に最悪のケースをシミュレーションしてもらいました。そして私に来た報告は、福島原発から250キロの圏内、これは我が国の国土の3分の1を占めます。そしてその中に住む人口、人々は5000万人、我が国の人口の 40% を占めます。その範囲でその5000万人が逃げなければいけなくなる。それが最悪のシナリオという報告でありました。
So at the time, I commissioned an expert from the Commission to make a scenario of what would be the worst case that we might be facing in this time. And the report which he came to me with said that we would be facing the situation of having to evacuate people within a 250-kilometer radius of the nuclear power plant. This would mean 1/3 of the whole of the land of Japan as a whole country. And this would mean a population of 50 million people, 50 million people, which is 40% of the entire population of the country. And so considering how to have so many people escape or evacuate safely in this kind of time.
現在でも福島の原発に近い人たち十数万人が避難をし、また避難をする途中で病院やお年寄りが相当の人たちがその途中で命を落としました。
In the reality of what happened in Fukushima, there is still well over 100,000 people who are being forced to live in evacuation even today. There was also, at the time of the evacuation in Fukushima, many people, particularly sick people or elderly people, people who were in hospital, who actually lost their lives in the process of the evacuation.
もし5000万人の人間が逃げるとしたら、相当多くの人がその過程で亡くなり、さらには相当長期間にわたって日本という国は国としての機能を発揮できなくなっていたと思います。
And if we had had to come to terms with the situation of having to evacuate 50 million people, I believe we also would have had this risk of so many people also losing their lives within this process of evacuation, considering how to do this safely. And also considering the long-term implications of this, such an event would have also meant that Japan, for a very long time, probably would have lost all of its capacity to even function as a country.
私はそのことを知ったときに、私のそれまで原子力発電所を安全を注意すれば使ってもいいと考えていたその考え方を180度変えました。
When I learned and considered these facts, this made me realize that what I had believed until then, believing that if controlled and managed safely, then it would be possible to operate nuclear power plants safely. When considering this, I realized that I had been completely wrong and changed my opinion 180 degrees.
これほどの被害を出す事故は私の知る限り戦争以外ではありません。
I cannot imagine any other event which would cause such an immense scale of damage and devastation other than perhaps a huge scale war.
また地震、津波、台風といったそういう災害はその発生そのものを人間の力では止めることはできませんから、どうやれば例えば高いところに住むとかそういう 発生は防げないけれども、被害を防ぐということを努力しなきゃなりません。
When we consider other forms of disasters such as earthquakes, tsunami, or typhoons, well, of course, it's not possible for human beings to completely prevent these kinds of disasters. It is possible to mitigate them to an extent, about thinking about where to build houses and these sorts of things.
しかし、原発事故というものは、人間が作った原発による事故ですから、それをなくすることは簡単です。
However, in the case of a nuclear power plant disaster, because this is created by human beings, it is very simple to also stop such an accident from happening.
つまりは原発をすべてなくすればいいわけです。
And the way to do this would be to get rid of all nuclear power plants.
私はその時から原発をなくする方向に政策の舵を切ると同時に、原発に代わって再生可能エネルギーを増やしていく、そういう政策に切り替えました。
And since then, I changed my policy to focus on the two things of first looking at how to move away from nuclear power, to move for a no nuclear policy, and at the same time, how to increase renewable energy as an alternative to this.
固定価格を買取制度を導入して2年半の間に太陽光をはじめとして再生可能エネルギーが従来の3倍、2年半の間に3倍程度に拡大をしております。
Since I introduced the feed-in tariff system in Japan during my time as Prime Minister, it has now been 2.5 years. And in that time, in just 2.5 years, we now have 3 times the amount of renewables, including particular solar.
このペースで拡大すれば10年ぐらいの間には、従来原発によって発電していた電力は、ほぼ再生可能エネルギーによって発電できる、このように確信しております。
And I believe that if we are able to continue at this pace, then within 10 years we will be able to meet the amount of energy which was provided by nuclear before the disaster through renewable sources.
そして今回2度目のオーストラリアを訪問して改めて強く感じたことがあります。それはオーストラリアという国は再生可能エネルギーを作り出す上で最も大きなポテンシャルを持っている、可能性を持っているということであります。
This is my second visit to Australia, and on this occasion, once again, I have also been able to strongly feel that Australia is one of the countries with the most potential for renewable energy anywhere in the world.
平らで太陽が降り注ぐ土地、これはオーストラリアには我が国の何十倍何百倍と存在しております。
And I believe Australia being such a large, immense, flat country and being washed by so much sun, blessed by so much sun, has maybe more tens or even hundreds of times more of this potential than we have in Japan.
原発だけでなく地球温暖化のことも合わせて考えますと、そうした再生可能エネルギーで化石燃料と原発を使わないでも、私はオーストラリアにおいては十分エネルギーを生産できる。それにはそんなに長い時間はかからないと確信しております。
And I believe that nuclear power plants, not only for the reason of the dangers, but also considering the dangers of global warming, Australia really has the potential to be able to produce enough energy through renewable means to move completely away from dependence not only on nuclear power but also on fossil fuels, and to be able to really move away and produce enough just through renewable sources.
例えば、ドイツにおいては2050年までに電気だけでなく全てのエネルギーの 80% を再生可能エネルギーで、生み出そうとしております。私は日本も同じ目標に向かって進めば、ドイツと同様に2050年までには8割のエネルギーを再生可能エネルギーで賄うことが日本でもできる。オーストラリアで言えばもっと早い段階でできると、このように確認しております。
If we look at the example of Germany, which has set a target to have 80% of its energy, not only electricity but all energy met by renewables by the year 2050, I believe that it would be possible for also Japan to try and work towards and to achieve such a target. And this could be done also by 2050 in Japan. In the case of Australia, I believe this could be done even sooner.
昨日、そして今日と先住民の皆さんからこのウラニウムの鉱山についていろいろとお話を聞きました。
Over the days of yesterday and today, I've had the opportunity to learn much about the issues of uranium mines from meeting with indigenous people here in Australia.
先住民の皆さんから自分たちの土地から取り出されたウラニウムが福島原発で使われて事故を起こした、そのことを申し訳なく思うということを言われたときに、私は非常にショックを受けました。当時に感激をしました。
And when I heard from the traditional owners talking about their sorrow and concern about the fact that uranium, which was dug up from their land, was used in the nuclear plant at Fukushima and was involved in the accident there, when they expressed their sorrow to me, I was very shocked to hear this, but at the same time very deeply moved.
つまり、ウラニウムを買おうとしたのは日本という国であり、あるいは東電です。ですからそれを使って事故を起こした責任は日本の国にあり、東電であります。決してアボリジニの皆さんに責任があるわけではありません。それにもかかわらず、自分たちの土地から生み出された、取り出されたウラニウムを使った福島原発が事故を起こしたことを、自分たちの半ば責任として感じておられるということにショックを受け、そして感激をしたわけであります。
And of course, it was Japan and it was TEPCO which bought the uranium from Australia. And the responsibility for the disaster which happened also lies with the country of Japan and with TEPCO for this. It is not, I believe, the responsibility, it is not the fault of the people of Australia, of the indigenous people. However, the fact that they expressed their deep sorrow and feelings about the fact that the uranium from their land was in the plant at Fukushima really shocked me very much, but also moved me deeply.
私たちは持続可能な社会を作るということを日本においてもよく言います。しかし、その持続可能という時間の長さが非常に短い長さ、10年、20年、30年という長さで考えることが大半であります。しかし、先住民の皆さんの話を聞いていると、持続可能な形でこのオーストラリアという地と生きてきた、まさに何万年もの間持続可能な生活をしていた、そのことがこの言葉のこの考え方の基本にあると、そう感じました。
Often in Japan, I also discuss the necessary for sustainability and how we need to move towards a more sustainable way of living. However, there is often a tendency for this to be only thought of in the span of a very short time, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. However, learning from the experiences of the Aboriginal people here in Australia, And the way that they have lived for tens of thousands of years here on this land, together with this land, has really showed me that at the core of their very beliefs is this concept of sustainability, and this is connected to the words which they shared to me in their expression of sorrow and concern.
現在我が国でも原発をさらに継続して使おうという政治家や経済人がいます。その多くの人たちは40代、50代の現役のビジネスマンです。しかし、同じビジネスマンでもリタイアして60、70、80歳になると目の前の利益ではなくて子供や孫、まさに次の世代のことを考えて原発に反対をする人が増えていく。これが多分他の国も同じだと思いますが、我が国の状況です。
In the case at Japan at the moment, there are several or many politicians or businessmen who are trying to push for a return to nuclear power in Japan. However, the majority of these people are in their 40s and 50s. They are now active, as businessmen or politicians. However, if we look at people who are perhaps of an older generation, people who are retired in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, there is a growing number of people within that generation who are looking not only at the immediate profits right in front of them, but are thinking about their children's future, their grandchildren's future, what to do for the future generations. And so many more people becoming opposed to nuclear energy within this older generation also. I believe this is also perhaps happening in other places around the world too.
3.11 前には54基の原発が我が国で、存在しておりました。しかし、現在の時点では、すべての原発が運転を停止しております。
Before the March 11 disaster, there were 54 nuclear power plants in Japan. However, today, all of these nuclear power plants have stopped operating.
これは定期点検に入った原発をもう一度再稼働させるときの条件を厳しくしたこと、そして多くの国民が再稼働に反対していること、この結果、我が国の稼働している原発の数はどんどん減っていって、今から10ヶ月前にゼロになって、この10ヶ月間は一機も動いていないというのが現状です。
And this has come about as a result of two factors. One being much stricter conditions were brought in place to restart the nuclear power plants, which were stopped for regular maintenance and so on. And the second point being the very strong opposition from many members of the public against the restart of the nuclear power plants. So this meant that the nuclear power plants were gradually, those operating were becoming fewer and fewer. And now 10 months ago is when we finally had 0 nuclear power plants operating in Japan. So for the past 10 months, there has been 0 operation of nuclear power plants.
しかし、私たちの民主党政権が自民党政権に変わった後、現在の政権は再稼働させるべきと、その審査をしている委員会に強い圧力をかけています。
However, after our government, the party of the Democratic Party of Japan, after the election changed to the Liberal Democratic Party, the current government, they are now pushing for more restart of the nuclear power plants and also putting great pressure on the regulatory authorities for this reason.
この数ヶ月の間に最初の再稼働する原発が最初の再稼働が始まるかどうか、一番重要な戦いの時に当たっております。
And this moment now, we are facing the most important struggle in regards to the restart, where in these months we are facing the situation where one of the first of the nuclear power plants may be restarted.
そして、たとえ少数の原発が再稼働されることがあったとしても、決して 3.11 前のように50基を超える原発が使われることはもはや日本ではありません。 つまり 3.11 前のように多くのウランを輸入する必要はなくなっているのが現在の日本の状況であります。
However, even if some of the nuclear power plants in Japan were to be restarted, it will not return to the kind of scale of such as 50 nuclear power plants as we had before the disaster. So even if they are restarted, I believe it's important to remember that Japan will not have a need to import as much uranium as it was before the disaster, even if the restart goes ahead.
そして今回こちらに来まして、核燃料のサイクルというのが最初がウラン鉱からウランを取り出す、そして原発で使う、そしてそれを廃棄する。しかし廃棄された原発は長い時間、例えば10万年にわたって放射能を出し続け、人間にとって危険な存在となる。このことを考えますと、まさに原発を使ってきた日本は原発をやめるし、そのことがひいてはこの西オーストラリアにおけるウラン鉱の開発を結果として抑えることにつながってくる。ぜひ共にその方向に向けて頑張りたいと思っています。
And coming here to Australia, I have been able to see firsthand the front end of the nuclear fuel cycle. And considering this, we can see the link between where it all begins at the uranium mining, from there to the nuclear power plants, and then the issue of the waste which comes out of this process also, and how to manage this waste, which continues to be very highly radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years even, and to pose dangers to the existence, dangers to human beings. When we consider this, I think that the only option we have is to stop the nuclear power plants. And I believe for the situation here in Western Australia also, as a result of stopping the nuclear power plants, this will also eventually lead to the stop of any of the discussion for the uranium mining here in Western Australia also. So I hope that we can work together in this direction.
今、地球上に存在している人間を含むあらゆる生物は、地球の条件と、いわば地球と共存できる生物が現在、この地球上に存在しているわけであります。しかし、原発を稼働させると、地球上には存在しない物質が生まれます。それがプルトニウムです。そしてこのプルトニウムが地球上に現れたのはわずか80年ほど前のことでありました。まだプルトニウムと人間が長く共存できるかどうかは分かっておりません。そういった意味でこのプルトニウムを生み出す原発をなくすることは人間と地球が共存していく上でのどうしても守らなければいけないそういう道筋だとこのことを最後に申し上げたいと思います。
And finally, when we consider human beings and all of the living creatures here on this earth, they are living together and coexisting with the earth in conditions which mean that they are able to be together to share the earth. However, when we consider things like the operations of nuclear power plants, this produces materials which did not exist in the natural world. In other words, plutonium. Plutonium was only created 80 years ago, only first appeared on this earth 80 years ago. And it's still not clear at all if plutonium and human beings can actually coexist together for a long time. So when we consider these issues also, I think the only option we have is to stop these nuclear power plants which are producing this plutonium. And this is what is necessary in order to be able to protect the world and humanity in this way.
Thank you very much.
thank you, former Prime Minister, for that excellent speech. So many excellent points that you made. That insight into what it must be like when within you the welfare of your nation is vested and you have tragic circumstances, and you gave us that insight into how that was, how it must have felt. To then talk about the issue of the evacuation of some 50 million people, and to then, of course, remind us as Australians about the good fortune we have to be so rich when it comes to all sorts of renewable energy options. And when I think as well of the wind, the wave, the geothermal, the solar thermal, the photovoltaic solar panels, biomass, the potential for smart grids, obviously we are so lucky in Australia to be able to avoid things like the whole nuclear cycle. Thank you as well for acknowledging the sustainable custodianship of Australia's first people on this land. I think one of the things that struck me most about your presentation, sir, was the way that you, in such a dignified manner, explained how you had a change of heart, a change of view, and saw that the nuclear way was not the best for your country, that that there are alternatives, and that a country that is so dependent on energy can look to alternatives, and you've set targets for that, and that's a wonderful achievement. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the organisers have asked that I say a few words about the WA Labor Party's position. And can I be very clear that our State Parliamentary Labor Party is very much opposed to the mining of uranium. And if I can quote you very briefly from our party platform, a platform that's debated at every one of our state conferences, and our state conferences are open to observers. Of course, you can become a member of the Labor Party and be active in the development of our policies as well. But at our state conference that was held early in July, we reaffirmed our position, and it reads in the chapter regarding the keeping of Western Australia as a nuclear-free state. It says, Labor will continue to oppose the mining and export of uranium. So I don't think we can make it any clearer than that. That is our position. In discussing tonight, I talked with our Shadow Minister for Energy, Bill Johnson, and Bill highlighted to me some of the economic aspects of nuclear power in Western Australia. He pointed out that when you're looking at plants that cost somewhere in the region of $3 billion to $5 billion, that in fact, in his view, it's merchant bankers that will ensure that Western Australia never becomes a home to a nuclear power plant, simply because of the poor investment return that such a thing would provide, the fact that our overnight load on the grid, 1,000 megawatts at best, that would not be sufficient to justify ever the construction of a nuclear power plant. The issue of nuclear energy does get raised by people who are often the ones who would never be putting up the money for such a plant. They're not the investors. It's simply, I'm afraid to say, politicians who want to fly a kite. So, ladies and gentlemen, the position of WA Labor on nuclear power plants is very clear, and our position on the mining of uranium in Western Australia is very clear as well. And Martin McGowan is very happy for me to make that clear to you, and if there is anyone who's in any doubt, please do come and see me afterwards. Now, the next speaker tonight, I'd like to introduce our final speaker tonight, in fact, Australian Greens Senator Scott Ludlam, and spokesperson for nuclear industry. Scott has visited Japan on many occasions in this capacity and has been a great advocate for a nuclear-free Australia. Please welcome Scott.
Somebody has left a pair of glasses up here if you're looking for them. They're just here and they're safe. Thank you, Chris. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that we are on Aboriginal ground, the traditional country, the Wurundjeri Noongar people, and thank Auntie Miggly and Uncle Alfie for your words in welcoming us up here, reminding us of your very, very long stewardship of this beautiful part of the world, and also reminding us that Aboriginal people here in Australia and also around the world are the ones who've borne the heaviest burden and really faced the front line when the nuclear industry in its various incarnations, whether it be the front end of uranium mining, the back end of nuclear waste, or the horrific bombings, test bombings here in Australia, it's Aboriginal communities who have borne the brunt and have the most important stories to tell. From Prime Minister Kan, I, on behalf of the room, offer my profound thanks for your words and the respect with which you've acknowledged this crowd and the role that you played in saving your country. Very hard for me to conceive of what it must be like to receive a briefing from your expert committee on the evacuation of 50 million people. And having spent a very brief period of time with Koriyama-san and Mary, who have also travelled a very long way to be down here with us, to stand on a beach at a place called Odaka, which had been devastated by the tsunami, and realised that we were standing only, I think, about 10 or 12 kilometres from the reactor cores, which had forced the evacuation of 160,000 people, and then to reflect, standing on that beach thinking this is what the end of the world would look like, that it could have been so much worse, that in fact, under Prime Minister Kan's leadership, and indeed those TEPCO technicians who stayed on site, stayed at the plant, didn't evacuate the building when some voices were arguing that they should in fact evacuate, stayed there and held it together. And we know that nuclear disasters have a start date, they do not have an end date. That was the case at 3 Mile Island, where no human has entered that reactor building since 1978. It was the case at Chernobyl, August 1986, and now it's the case at Fukushima. But with no direct experience of nuclear power, fortunately in this country, it's difficult for us to understand. And so travelling to Japan for me was a very personal experience because 3 years ago now, 2 or 3 years ago now, in a committee meeting I was able to establish with some senior bureaucrats, I think in the Safeguards Division, that Australian uranium was loaded into all 4 of the units. The 3 that melted down, the 1 that had been powered down, of the Fukushima complex. Australian uranium from Kakadu, from Central South Australia. And reflecting on the fact that the industry has been trying to start these mines up here in Western Australia for a period of 30 or more years, more than 30 years now, and that there are those, Joe, Kado, others in the room, who have been part of that story from the very beginning, and are a very important part of the reason why there is not one single uranium mine operating in Western Australia to this day. And I'd like to offer my thanks to you. While I was there, it wasn't too long after I was there that the Japanese government handed down the findings of the public findings of study into the disaster, and pretty much on the first page of the executive summary, the part that had been translated into English, it said the Great Tohoku earthquake was a natural disaster. Could potentially have been predicted, but it couldn't have been prevented. It was a natural disaster, and the planet would do that to us from time to time. But that Fukushima was man-made. There is nothing about a meltdown or a melt-through at an atomic reactor that could be considered a natural disaster. It was man-made. That report, government's own report, was scathing as to the operations of what many in the Japanese community have now started to call the nuclear mafia. as the institutional power, which should be very familiar to those of us in Australia who are battling the fossil fuel industry, which holds the same position of political and economic incumbency as the nuclear genpatsu, the nuclear industry, holds in Japan. Calling it the nuclear mafia was something of a shock until we realised how deeply entrenched the industry's tentacles go to the very top levels of Japanese life. And that, again, is why it's so important to recognise the voice of such a senior statesperson to be conducting a national tour down here, down under the source, the headwaters of where this whole industry begins. It's such a powerful experience. Can you imagine what we know of Japanese ingenuity, innovation, engineering, manufacturing skills turned in the direction to face the sun, the wind, the waves? I'm really, really glad to hear, Prime Minister, your invocation of the importance and the potential of the renewable energy industry in Australia and around the world. But can you imagine if Japan stood down the failed nuclear experiment, as has been done in other countries and other parts of the world, and got its industrial base behind the clean energy sector? How rapidly we could turn this ship about. Here in Western Australia, we call our proposals Energy 2029, a proposal to power our state from sun, wind, wave permanently, eliminate the fossil fuel inputs permanently from our energy system. In Japan, eliminated nuclear inputs permanently from their energy system and put this industry out of business once and for all. But to be able to say, as Della so powerfully did at the beginning of the event, no more Fukushima, it's going to take work. It's going to take the volunteers, the extraordinary people from Peace Boat, those in the Green Party and allies in Japan and around the world. It means speaking out and standing up while there is still time. And it's a privilege to stand with you and your colleagues today. But I've got to say, the reason that there are no uranium mines here in Western Australia, the reason that all those units are shut down in Japan is no accident. It takes work, it takes enormous effort and creativity by volunteers, largely, day after day after day, so that we can enjoy clean air, clean water, and a country that is still intact. So I've got a request for you tonight. I wasn't sure if I was going to do this or not, but bugger it, I'm going to. Can you just put your hands up if you don't know what this is, if you haven't seen this before? If it doesn't look familiar. All the way up, all the way up. It's a little bit tricky to see with the lights. Okay, so that's great. So most people in the room haven't seen this. Well, you're not going to be able to say that in another 30 seconds' time. What this is effectively for those who can afford it. If you can't afford it, I know people put an enormous amount of time, and I'm very well aware that I'm preaching to the converted. If you're here, you're probably already with us. But this is tremendously important. The movement to turn off the tap, close this industry down at source, has very powerful roots here in WA, going for a long period of time, but it does take a small amount of money. Now what this is a pledge for $50 a month. Set it and forget it. Sign up and it basically just comes out, click, 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 turn it off if you need to, hopefully you won't need to. $50 a month for the next, until the industry is shut down. Yeah? When the industry is formally declared extinct and done and the nuclear age is over, we will stop taking, or not we, but the movement will stop taking the $50 out of your credit card. Now Nia just told me that for every 10 of these that we sign up tonight, buys one full-time day of a campaigner. That includes things like trips out to country, mobile phone, but basically a starvation wage, and not that much more than that, for some of the extraordinarily talented campaigners that we've got here, working their asses off to keep this state nuclear free. So 10 sign-ups is one day of a campaigner. Are you with me? Put your hand up if you're up for it. We're going to count hands right now. 1, 2, 3. I'm just up to the first 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Can I get 20? 11, 12, 13. Good. 13. Keep your hands up, please. This is important. We need 2 days. Yep. 14, 15, thank you. Keep going. 8. Hands up, please. Can I get 20 hands? I think we're up to about 16. Keep putting them up. 17, thank you. 3 more. 3 more. 1. Was that a hand? Careful, this is like being at an auction. If you twitch, I'm going to grab you. Can I get 2 more? 1, thank you so much. And 1 right up the back. We just got 2 full-time days of campaign that kicks off. Thank you so much. That's great. So you see the little stand at the desk, and please now don't leave now that you've done that, because that's very, very exciting. That just puts a regular foundation for campaigning, including the folk who assisted former Prime Minister Kan's tour. Naoto Kan, thank you so much for being here, for your colleagues. Thank you all for the part that you play in keeping our beautiful state and our planet nuclear free.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for the demonstration on how fundraising can be done. I'd like to thank all our guests for their wonderful presentations, in particular former Prime Minister Naoto Kan. And thank you, sir, for visiting Australia at this time when we consider our involvement in the nuclear trade. Thank you for your speech tonight. Konban go sanka shita ite da ki ma shite arigoto gozai ma shita. It's been a most insightful evening, and we hope that this is a catalyst for renewed energy in keeping WA nuclear free. I'd like to thank the organisers of tonight, especially the Conservation Council, and especially Mia Pepper, our wonderful... and to the other partners who've been involved in helping us have former Prime Minister Kan here. The Environment Centre of the Northern Territory, the Gundje Himai Aboriginal Corporation, the Australian Conservation Foundation, Friends of the Earth, Keep Queensland Free, Nuclear Free, and the Electrical Trades Union of Queensland and Northern Territory branch. I've one small announcement to make, and that is for a Mayors for Peace forum that's being held in the Fremantle Town Hall on Monday the 22nd of September from 1 till 3 p.m. and I gather that there are flyers at the back of the hall if you're interested in attending. But ladies and gentlemen, especially thank you so much for your enthusiasm, your passion, and for your participation tonight. Thank you.
Ciao everyone.